One of the earliest childhood memories that I have is going to a museum with my grandmother in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to this live exhibit where you had to solve the mystery of who killed Sherlock Holmes. And you go through the streets of Victorian London. And at the end, you actually find out Sherlock Holmes isn't dead and that an actor comes out and explains what really happened. And this is a shock for an exhibit that is over 20 years old at this point. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself murdered Sherlock Holmes. That's always stuck with me. It's kind of like the how you can take Sherlock Holmes and be a little schlocky and be a little tongue in cheek and be really theatrical about it. It's always been something that's really stayed with me. Same as how I'm sure the Great Mouse Detective. I'm sure Ratigan is burned on the CRTV somewhere in the bowels of the earth from the amount of times that I watched that VHS. It's fun to kind of explore the different aspects of Sherlock Holmes because he's lasted for well over 200 years. It's weird to think that there's a whole subgenre based off of the Cthulhu mythos? Yeah, there's a whole like subgenre of Sherlock Holmes versus Cthulhu. Okay, this is a subgenre. This fascinates me because when you think of Sherlock Holmes, you think of him as a very much like a rational figure. He wants to solve every mystery in the world against H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos, where the Cthulhu mythos is more like the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, and kind of cosmic horror as itself. And it's one of these things like, hey, that's an interesting concept. A very rational person versus unknown horror where the slightest truth might drive you insane. Now, if only Sherlock Holmes can solve the mystery of H.P. Lovecraft's cat. What's his name? Oh no, don't look that up. So the very first thing that I read, which actually I believe is sort of the catalyst for a lot of the stuff, is Neil Gaiman's short story, A Study in Emerald, which is a subversion of a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories. It is a remake of the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, but it really shows kind of how good and evil blur lines. And for me, it's an interesting story because it kind of sets up the precedent of what would happen if a character that is very smart has to deal with something like a god or kind of a concept that flips the entire reality on its head. And for me, I really find that to be so fascinating. And this kind of ushered in another set of short stories. Again, I'm not going to really spoil any of these stories. I kind of wanted to explore what really goes on. The problem that I've noticed throughout a lot of these stories is for them to work, Sherlock Holmes has to be the world's biggest idiot, or he has to be the biggest arrogant person ever, because the standard theme is that he scoffs at the idea, and Watson's the person that's scared completely shitless. They all have the same type of trapping where, again, he's an idiot, and Watson's the person that's, is the person that goes insane. I noticed that there's a lot of other short story collections. There's one in like 2015, but I also wanted to kind of talk about the other big series that I read, which was the Cthulhu Casebooks. This was by James Lovegrove, which it's supposed to be a play in that he's a descendant of Lovecraft from the English side of things, if I'm getting that correctly. And it's funny to actually like read it because it's an actual series of adventures that take Sherlock Holmes and Watson in different periods of their life. And it's like kind of retroactively being in the canon because this is another subgenre that happens. It's like, here's a lost mystery story from Sherlock Holmes. Ooh, we found it in a cupboard or we found it buried underwater for some weird reason. And it's fun to like kind of see this. But when it comes to the Cthulhu casebook stuff, I was actually having a lot of fun because it is both a love letter to Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft in the sense of they get the themes completely right for both of them. You have a lot of Lovecraft themes and it's fun to kind of see how you can take these two genres and flip them on their head and kind of see what works and what doesn't because it's polar opposites. When it comes to H.P. Lovecraft, it's very much grand, eldritch, giant words that you need a dictionary for in a long dead Victorian language. When you get to pretty much Sherlock Holmes, which a lot of these stories are they're very simple. They don't use these super big words. They're written in very much like it's not like an epistolate, but it's very much like you're getting it almost like a diary entry from Watson. But when you want to deal with like a supernatural entity, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Hound of the Baskerville is such a famous story. It's Sherlock Holmes versus the supernatural and who comes out on top. So when you have Sherlock Holmes versus the entire Cthulhu mythos, where things are completely irrational and Sherlock Holmes is supposed to be, looking for answers and finding the rationality into it, but there isn't any. You're falling into the H.P. Lovecraft themes. Really does work. And it's fun to actually go through all these short stories and go through a lot of these types of twists and turns and try to figure out, what would actually happen. Probably if Sherlock Holmes was in here, he would be banging his head against, a padded cell by the end of it, because when it comes to H.P. Lovecraft, that man was a nihilist, man. And Sherlock Holmes is the exact opposite, where he would rather, play his violin. He does have his melancholy moods. So there is that, where it's kind of, you have like that verge of sanity versus insanity at times. But, does it work as a subgenre? Kinda. I think there's a lot of compare and contrast. I think one of the reasons why it's so appealing to have Sherlock Holmes in the Cthulhu mythos is because you have this beyond, like, the biggest supernatural thing you can have without it being Dracula or something else in the public domain, where you have this giant expanded world where it's, everything's connected, much like Sherlock Holmes stories, which are weirdly enough still connected, because again, that's supposed to be more in reality. So it's fun to kind of see how you have the Cthulhu mythos and the mythos of Sherlock Holmes bleeding in, and you have what would happen if this person has to fight, pretty much either giant world organizations or having these untold truths. For me, I find that to be fun, but for it to work, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through, and it's fun pulpy reading. But if you're trying to read it as as I kept reading through the subgenre, right, everything felt like it was going the same, or it just, again, it sometimes feels like fan fiction, because a lot of these short stories are pretty, actually, I guess all of it's fan fiction. You just have these mashups. If I had to recommend one short story out of all these, it probably would be A Study in Emerald, because Neil Gaiman's really good at what he does. And it's such a fun twists and turns. I'm not going to spoil much of it, but go read it. As well as, I do recommend the first Cthulhu Casebook. And the video game is fun. You can get it on Steam. I just didn't play it. I didn't really want to talk about it all that much, because for me, I probably wouldn't be able to finish it, because I have a hard time with those video games, just because I just don't have the patience for these super duper puzzles that you have to like go all around England for. Have you guys ever read any of these short stories? What do you think of this weird subgenre? Do you like the Cthulhu mythos? Do you kind of like Sherlock Holmes? I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments, because it always fascinates me to hear from you all. Thank you all so much, everyone, for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, maybe consider subscribing down below. I would really appreciate that. Well, like always, everyone, may your food and drink ever be tasteful. May your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.